Hello everyone. Today I wanted to talk a little about the idea of protections against fairies. This sort of came up when a friend of mine had contacted me saying that she was having some issues with elf locks. Elf locks, for those of you that don't know, are sort of unexplained mats or tangles that appear in your hair overnight. So you don't have them when you go to sleep, you do have them when you wake up. And the idea, of course, that these are things that can't be explained. So if you have a hair type that's prone to matting or tangling, my oldest daughter was like that, so she had a lot of this sort of thing going on, but not supernaturally, then if there's any real-world explanation, it just is a real-world situation. But if there is no real way to explain it physically, if you can sort of eliminate all of the logical reasons or causes for that sort of phenomena to occur, the idea is that it's being caused by the good folk. And at least in Celtic belief, this is not considered to be a good thing. It's actually considered to be quite a concerning thing. It would indicate that they are, during the night, either intentionally matting and knotting your hair as a punishment, or are transforming you and forcing you to carry them, sometimes in the form of a horse, across the land. We see this in a lot of different folk stories, for example. But the belief in elf knots is widespread in all Celtic language-speaking cultures. It occurs not only to human beings, but also to horses, who will get these knots in their manes. It's thought to be sort of unlucky to detangle them. Usually they have to be cut out. I think there's some symbolism there with the scissors being iron. We'll get more into iron here in a minute. But the general idea with them is that if you have that happening, it's not a good thing, and it's also an indication that the good folk are messing with you in some sense, and not in a positive way. So my friend had contacted me about this was going on, and sort of asked what to do. And besides the cutting it out with scissors, if that's an option, one of the things that's usually recommended is for the person to then sleep with some iron physically on them. And in the more modern folklore, this would be a safety pin attached to the person's clothing. Safety pins, of course, being made of steel, and steel and iron being a very common item that's recommended to protect against fairies, which inspired me to the topic of this video for today. So, moving outside of elf locks in particular, when we are in situations where we feel like we need to protect against the good folk, we're concerned that we might have their attention in a negative way, there's indications that they are in fact messing with a person in some sense, which can take a lot of different routes. You might have things going missing, might have a lot of bad luck, might have ill health, unexplainable accidents going on around you. There's a lot of different ways. I should probably do a whole separate video how to tell when the fair folk are messing with you. But if you are concerned and feel like you need to protect against them, or just in general, you want to have some protections around you, the majority of people in traditional cultures that believe in these beings would have had some protections around their homes, in particular, around their barns if they were farmers, on their person in a lot of instances when they were out and about, because there was a belief that these beings could, sometimes inexplicably, cause people significant or serious problems, or kidnap them. So probably the main thing that's recommended, which I've already mentioned briefly, is iron. And to sort of immediately address some confusion with this, iron and steel are effectively the same thing. I have seen some people who are under the impression that they're not, that you need to get true iron or real iron, and that you can't use steel, that steel is sort of a acceptable substitute but it doesn't work as well. Steel is still like 92 to 98% iron. So it really does have basically the same effectiveness that different forms of iron would have, just so we're all clear. Steel, iron, same thing. Also, when you see references in folklore or anecdotes to cold iron, I've seen a lot of confusion about that too, with people thinking that that means a specific forging process or a specific type of iron. Cold iron is an older term, a traditional term for iron weapons. You'll also see it in the form of cold steel today, that usually referencing guns. But cold iron would have been a term that we would have seen in older works to reference usually a sword or a knife made out of iron. Just to clear that up. So when you see it being recommended in different sources to use cold iron as a defense against the Fae folk, or to ward against the Fae folk, what they're specifically referencing is to use an iron weapon, usually an iron blade of some sort. Steel works just as well, as we've established. Common forms of iron that would be used as wards, nails, any size nail, any kind of nail, really doesn't matter. In some Norse traditions, they would actually nail an iron nail into the doorpost so that it was sticking out a little bit. That was supposed to ward against Hulda folk, hidden folk, elves, that sort of thing. You'll often see people nailing up an iron horseshoe over their doorways. This is also supposed to have connections to drawing luck into a home, but it does protect the home and ward it against fairies in general, negative spirits. Iron itself is not only a protection against the good folk who may have ill intentions, but also against the magic of witches that might be sent against you, negative magic in this case, or demons. So iron has long been believed to have protective qualities against the supernatural and any sort of magic, enchantments that might be sent against a person or a household. Why iron? Honestly, we don't know for sure. There's nothing that really explicitly says why iron. We just know that it's this sort of ubiquitous recommended protection. It does not work against absolutely every supernatural being or otherworldly being. I forgot to mention it is also a protection against ghosts. Toss that one in there too. But there are specific otherworldly beings that are not bothered by iron. In the British tradition, there's red caps. We also see that in the Scottish, I should add. Specifically, I guess that falls into the auspices of British. Either way, we see red caps are reputed to wear iron-toed boots, so clearly iron and steel not going to bother them. A lot of times mill spirits or forge spirits are not said to be particularly bothered by iron because they're around it, acclimated to be around it. If we look in the Norse, Ettins or dangerous giants are often said to have iron on their person or live around iron, so it's not something that bothers them either. However, nonetheless, iron is usually the most recommended protection and is said to protect against the vast majority of otherworldly beings and generic supernatural creatures. I don't know how else to phrase that. As I mentioned, ghosts, demons, maleficent witches, all of that stuff. Sort of any negative magic that might be sent against you or try to get into your home. Iron is supposed to protect against that. Most of it. 90% of it. The word iron itself, etymologically, is rooted in a term for holiness, sort of the holy metal. So it's possible that that is at least part of where this idea of iron as this superlative protection comes from. But again, we don't really know for certain. We just know that it's very widely recommended. We'll see accounts in folklore and anecdotes of iron knives, of course, being used, iron nails, which I already mentioned, Iron scissors being opened into the form of a cross, often hung over cradles. Don't think too hard about that, it was kind of scary, but often hung over cradles or put underneath a child's mattress, specifically to defend children from being stolen by the good folk. Iron fire tongs, iron fire pokers, really any item that is made from iron will have this protective quality to it. People who are out traveling alone, particularly at night, would often carry an iron item on their person, if not a knife, because not everyone necessarily had knives all the time. They might have an iron nail in their pocket or something similar. The nature of the item, in most cases, unless they were specifically referenced to be cold iron, to be weapons, the nature of the item didn't really matter so much as the quality of it, the fact that it was iron, that it was made of iron, the substance. So really any iron that you can find or that you have could be used as a protection against the good people. There are people in modern terms who feel that part of the reason that fairies are less often experienced or encountered in today's world is because there is so much iron around humans, particularly in the more developed countries and the more developed areas. Again, not all fairy beings are put off by iron, so you will still find them pretty much everywhere, including cities. But the idea that we experience them less or less commonly, in part, is rooted in the fact that there is so much more worked iron around us all the time now. So that's definitely a big one. Another one that's often mentioned is salt. Salt is another material that has long been thought to have holy properties, to be blessing, to be used for consecration. It also used to be quite a luxury item. It was very expensive. It wasn't necessarily very common. So the idea of using salt to ward against, again, a variety of negative spirits, but particularly some of the otherworldly beings, is something that we find in a lot of material. Interestingly, the fairy faith in Celtic countries, there is an anecdote which mentions that the fair folk do not salt their food, that they don't eat salt, which could reinforce this idea that they don't, that they're averse to it, the same way that they're averse to iron. It's just not something that they want to be around or want to be exposed to, for whatever reason. Again, salt, not effective against absolutely everything. Clearly, any otherworldly being or fairy that's associated with the ocean, not going to be bothered by salt. But it is another one that's often mentioned or recommended in folklore and anecdotes. I had mentioned earlier opening scissors into the form of a cross. The idea of a cross being used and having protective qualities is something else that we find pretty regularly. It's possible that this might relate to the Christian symbolism. It's also possible that this connects to the older significance of the crossroads and the power of crossroads, and that is something that we see in multiple different cultures, not just Christian-related cultures. So I tend to lean towards the idea that the cross as a protective symbol is connected to the idea of the crossroads and not the Christian cross, but that's my personal opinion. Either way, the idea of using the cross for protection is something that we find, again, pretty much throughout the Celtic language-speaking countries. It's believed to ward off and protect against fairies. The good folk have a very complicated relationship with the Christian church. I will put this out there. I will also say, though, that in Christian-dominated countries this is true. If we're looking at beings like the jinn in Arabic countries, then the same would be true for Islam. They have a very complicated relationship to Islam there. Just as we would see fairies in the Celtic countries, where some of them do not seem to be bothered by Christianity and even seem very concerned about their place within it, while others are extremely averse to it and driven off by symbols of the faith or prayers. The same is true of the jinn in Arabic countries, Middle Eastern countries, where some of them are described as being Muslim and others are extremely averse to any Muslim symbolism or prayers. Just an interesting point to note. So when we're talking about the use of protections and warding against fairies and the symbol of the cross, and more generally getting into Christian symbols and prayers as protections against fairies, I don't recommend them as much because it is much more hit or miss. It seems like about half of them are not at all concerned with that system of faith. The other half will pretty much flee immediately. And that would include, let me see, the ringing of church bells, the presence of the Bible, reading from the Bible, reading Christian prayers of any sort, the symbol of the cross, of course. There are some that are said not to be able to set foot on Christian holy ground. So pretty much anything connected to any of that. Holy water. In some cases, those can all be used to protect against fairies. I had mentioned the red cap earlier, that is a type of fairy that is not bothered by iron. It's known to wear iron. They use iron weapons, all of that fun stuff. The only thing that does defend against red caps are supposedly Christian symbolism and Christian prayers. So, definitely something to keep in mind. There are a selection of herbs that can be used to ward and protect against fairies. Some of those can vary greatly by region. So I do recommend sort of looking into local folklore at what is and is not recommended. For example, in some parts of Ireland and Scotland, rowan is said to ward and protect against any sort of baneful magic, and also fairies. In other places, it's said that fairies are very fond of the rowan, that they eat rowan berries as their main food. So they have this sort of ambivalent relationship to the rowan. Same thing with the whitethorn and blackthorn. There's places where it is said that those woods can be used as protection against them. In many more places, it's said you are not supposed to mess with those trees, specifically because they're very associated with the fae folk and it will anger them. Just to give you an example of how varied this can be, in the song The Rocky Road to Dublin, one of the lyrics involves the narrator singing the song, saying they're going to cut a blackthorn to ward against ghosts and goblins. Goblins being sort of a generic term for the good people here. So that shows that it was believed, in some places at least, that a blackthorn could be used to ward against these spirits. But the blackthorn also has its very own type of fairy, the Lunatishi, that protects it and is supposed to be very angered if people harvest the blackthorn or cut the wood outside of very specific times. So we see this super ambivalent relationship. Also generally said that you should never bring a thorn inside a house because that will draw the attention of the fae folk and draw them in. But on the other hand, there are people who say that thorns, again, will ward and keep the fae away. So I'm putting this out there to say that I don't necessarily recommend using these particular ones, but so people are aware that these will show up in folklore and anecdotes as protections. It's a little more hit or miss. Another example of protections and wardings with the fairies that we see often, particularly in the Irish material, is what's called footwater. This is obviously not something we see as much today, but came from a period when people would not necessarily wear shoes as often. Personally, I don't wear shoes very much in the summer, so I can kind of understand a little bit of this. But either way, and when you would come into the house, the first thing you would do would be to wash your feet, because your feet would be dirty. And then you would get this sort of dirty water. And there are some areas of Ireland where it was said that having this bowl of dirty water in the home would ward off fairies, that they would not want to enter a home that had this dirty standing water in it. In other parts of Ireland, however, if you did not dump this water out immediately and you had the water in your home just standing there, that would actually allow the fairies to come into the home even if you had other protections and wards against them in place. So again, you really need to look into the local specific beliefs to decide what direction to go in here. More generally, the idea that the Fae folk of any iteration, the good neighbors, the hula folk, were very averse to filth, particularly bodily waste, urine, excrement. That is something that we do see in quite a lot of sources. The idea in the Norse and Icelandic that a slang term for urination was driving out the elves, because the belief was if you urinated on the ground that any elves that happened to be present would flee, because they just abhor that sort of thing. If we look at the very tragic story of Bridget Cleary, whose husband thought she was a changeling and sort of attempted to do this changeling exorcism, which resulted in her death, one of the things that's mentioned in several of the accounts was that she was either doused in urine or urine was poured on her in some way. And again, this is something that was believed to have the effect to drive out or ward against fairy beings because they were so averse to its presence. Again, I don't necessarily recommend using this one. If you happen to be lost in the woods and be concerned about fairies messing with you and you don't have any other options, I guess it's like a emergency survival warding method. But it is something to keep in mind. It's also something to keep in mind if you're out in an area that you feel is sacred, or if you're visiting a location that is a known fairy location, don't do that. When I was in Iceland last year, that was one of the things that we warned the people we were traveling with, you know, even under emergency circumstances, go a really good distance away, find another way to do what you need to do, but not on the ground, because it really does offend these spirits. So we're a little over 20 minutes now. Let's see, I've covered iron, salt, crosses more generally, different types of holy scripture, and some herbs, and foot water and urine. That does cover the majority of them. I do also want to touch, because I know I have a lot of pagan audience on my YouTube channel, pentacles. I'm sorry. This surprises a lot of people, but pentacles actually were used in the later Middle Ages to ward against fairies. I learned this when I was at the Fairies in the Fantastic Conference at Ohio State University this February. Professor Firth Green in his lecture talked about it and showed multiple examples of pentacles being used to ward doorways, butter boxes, different implements involved with weaving, basically things that fairies are known to be fond of messing with. And he was talking about the use of pentacles to protect against and ward against fairy beings. He is writing a book about this, which should be out, I think, next year. I'm looking forward to it, and I recommend it in advance just because it touches on this topic. But that is something to keep in mind if you are witchcraft inclined, that there are at least some types of the good folk who are warded off or averse to pentacles. So you might want to avoid those, or at least keep those away from spaces that you're encouraging fairies to be in. A little food for thought. Anyway, I will end it there for today, and I will see everyone in the next video. Have a good day.